History isn't always told from the throne. Sometimes it drips from the scaffold. Tonight, we journey into a grimy little corner of French history you probably didn't hear in school. The life of a poor sod who had one of the most thankless jobs in medieval and early modern France, the executioner. It's a tale of severed heads, flying tomatoes, deeply misunderstood career choices, and public shame, all soaked in centuries of superstition and bureaucracy. Before we start, if you enjoy these history narrations, please hit subscribe. And hey, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it over there? Now, let's begin. France. Centuries past, kings, revolutions, and public squares. The world was a slightly more fragrant place, and not in a good way. Cities bustled with merchants and filth. Nobles powdered their faces and ignored the plague. And the gallows creaked like it was part of the town orchestra. Among the many odd characters of the era, leech doctors, chicken-plucking apothecaries, and rat-chasing street kids, stood the royal executioner. Society shoved him somewhere between rats and demons. But he had a job to do, and do it he did. Sometimes with flair, often with blood splatter. Justice was swift, brutal, and public. It was less about fairness and more about putting on a good show. Town squares doubled as theatres of morality, where crowds cheered, jeered, and occasionally fainted at the sight of a well-swung axe. The executioner, always punctual, always efficient, always slightly terrifying. He might have walked the same streets. He tried to buy bread like a normal citizen. Bakers would toss the loaf onto the counter, like they were feeding a lion. Children were told if they misbehaved, they'd end up on Monsieur le Décapitateur's naughty list. He couldn't attend church. He couldn't marry freely. His social life had about the same appeal as lice in a monk's beard. But it paid. Oh yes, there were fringe benefits, land exemptions, occasional bribes, a guaranteed spot in local law. You'd think folks would want to thank the guy who made executions, not drag on forever. But no. Fear and superstition clung to him like congealed blood on his boots. He handled bodies like a grim butcher at the world's worst deli. And the world wanted to pretend he didn't exist right after cheering him on. Still, someone had to do it. Someone had to drop the blade, light the pyre, tighten the rope. And that someone almost always inherited the job, like a cursed family heirloom. Becoming a French executioner wasn't usually a personal dream. No one grew up saying, "I want to swing axes for a living." It passed down through families like an awkward mole or an ancient debt no one could dodge. In some places, it had to stay in the family, because nobody else would dare touch the role with a 10-foot pike. Training didn't involve textbooks and lectures either. It was a practical education. Hold the blade like this. Don't flinch at the gurgles. And if the head doesn't come off cleanly, pretend it did. Apprenticeship meant watching your father chop off heads at breakfast and prep gallows between bites of stale bread. Vacations were, well, non-existent. At best, you'd get fewer executions during Lent. At worst, a double feature after a public riot. And don't get too comfy thinking it was just chopping heads. Executioners were expected to do it all. Hangings, burnings, wheelings, that's the bone, shattering one, and public shaming. They also had to torture prisoners pre-trial for a good confession. Imagine trying to date while explaining that part of your CV. The worst part, you didn't even get the villain treatment. Villains at least had mystery. Executioners were just walking reminders of death's paperwork. People whispered your name, crossed the street to avoid you, and some believed merely touching you would bring bad luck or boils. But it was not glory, only stigma, blood and nightmares, and the occasional awkward run in with villagers who wanted nothing to do with him, unless they were enthusiastically throwing rotten fruit. His children were born into the same tainted surname, forced to carry the invisible mark of the scaffold. At school, if they even went, they were either feared or bullied, or both. One wrong sneeze, and the whole town started whispering about cursed air. The executioner's house, usually on the edge of town, somewhere between the pig pens and the communal latrine. Invitations to weddings, festivals, or pretty much any communal event were rarer than a peasant with all his teeth. And yet, every town needed him, desperately. As much as they denied it, they relied on him to keep order, even if that order came in the shape of a sharp iron blade and a hastily scribbled warrant. He lived off rumors, suspicion, and state funding, France's least loved civil servant. And his nightmares, those were free, replays of botched executions. Screaming crowds, limbs that didn't quite separate like they were supposed to. The blade doesn't always behave like the legend says. The human neck isn't always cooperative. And in those moments of fumbling and fear, the crowd turns fast, from bloodthirsty spectators to pitchfork enthusiasts. So no, there were no parades, no songs. No, thank you for your service. Just endless work. Countless lives ended in the name of justice, or what passed for it. And a lonely walk home, always on the shadowy side of the street. This is the story of the executioner. Executioners often came from executioner families. It wasn't so much a choice as a curse wrapped in a job title. Imagine being born swaddled and handed your family's legacy of sharpened steel and social exile, while other kids dreamed of being knights or cheese merchants or, dare to hope, a monk. Little Jin, Pierre was being taught the cleanest way to quarter a man without offending the crowd's delicate sensibilities. These families were their own strange little caste, somewhere between vital state instruments and human bad omens. They were given land, sometimes their own neighborhoods, mini executioner ghettos, like the infamous Rue de l'Otgout. Yes, that's Sewer Street in Paris. They developed their own networks, traditions, and grim camaraderie, because no one else wanted to share a pint with the guy whose daily agenda included burn 3 heretics and sharpen backup axe. Sons learned to tie nooses like other kids learned to tie shoes. Daughters were usually warned that marrying outside the profession was a one-way ticket to being ostracized in 2 villages instead of 1. And while a few tried to escape the legacy, maybe dream of farming or fleeing to the coast to sell oysters, society usually reminded them, loudly, where they came from. You were born with blood on your hands, you hadn't even spilled yet. Because when your name was synonymous with death, there wasn't much room for reinvention. The son of the hangman becomes the next hangman. Not out of passion, not out of ambition, but because literally no one else would touch the profession with a barge pole dipped in holy water. He'd watch his father prepare for an execution like other kids watched their dads polish shoes. Quietly, awkwardly, with a mix of morbid curiosity and resigned horror. Every lash knotted, every axe honed, every scythe, like movement rehearsed in the privacy of a workshop that smelled like metal, sweat, and something vaguely cursed. Trying to escape that path was like trying to wash your name out of the town ledger. The community remembered. Oh, they remembered. Even if you moved 3 towns away and started selling cabbages, someone would eventually gasp and whisper, "Isn't that Claude the Cleaver's boy?" Next thing you know, your cabbages are mysteriously declared haunted. Some sons internalized it and got really into the tools of the trade, collecting whips, cataloging nooses, polishing shackles, until they gleamed like they were headed to a wedding. Others sulked their way into the gallows business, turning up late to lashings and fantasizing about opening a bakery instead. But family loyalty was strong, and the crown's need for legally sanctioned killing was even stronger. If your bloodline was used to spilling blood, well, That was seen as a kind of twisted reliability. No matter how many tried to weasel out, the cycle repeated. A father fell, and the son stepped up, not for honor, not for praise, just because the job came with a house, a salary, and a lifelong guarantee of being shunned at dinner parties. Nobody wanted the job, but someone had to take it, and when the town crier bellowed out your father's death, it was like life snapped into place with a rusty, blood-stained click. Congratulations! You're now the most feared and least invited man in town. Hope you enjoy solo lunches inside. From literally everyone, including the goats. You inherited the axe, the block, and a legacy of silence at village festivals. The local blacksmith would make your tools, but wouldn't shake your hand. The butcher would nod, but wouldn't weigh your meat without first laying down a cloth like your touch transmitted doom. And God forbid your shadow landed on someone during market day, they might just scream, "Witch!" and accuse you of double duty. Dating? Don't make me laugh. Your romantic prospects were about as promising as a chicken in a fox convention. On rare occasions, you might marry another executioner's daughter, because who else would accept, tortures criminals for a living, and has a suspiciously well-oiled noose collection as a dating profile. If you ever brought flowers, they better not be red. Even your clothes betrayed you. The leather apron, the blackened boots, the tools strapped to your belt like a murderous handyman. It screamed, "I do horrible things with alarming regularity." There was no blending in. You could walk through a foggy alley with a hood on, and still people would whisper, "There goes the shadow." Even as a child, other children avoided you, not because you were mean or smelled like boiled cabbage, although that didn't help, but because your family tree read like the guest list at a haunted house. Kids on the playground would invent elaborate games just to avoid being on your team. You'd try to play stickball, and suddenly everyone needed to go churn butter or check on the pigs. Even the pigs looked a little wary. At school, if you dared show up, you'd sit alone, the empty bench next to you, an invisible barrier of superstition and inherited doom. Teachers taught around you like you were a sentient piece of cursed furniture. During group projects, you'd automatically be assigned silent research assistant, because apparently, "Don't let the executioner's kids speak or we'll all fail the harvest," was sound medieval logic. Birthday parties. Forget it. You could have had a pet unicorn and a wagon full of honey cakes and still not gotten a single RSVP. You once tried to hand out invitations and half the village reported a plague scare. And it didn't end there. As you got older, even coinage betrayed you. Villagers claimed your hands cursed their purses. There were rumors your copper denier could kill crops. Market sellers wouldn't touch your coins, not even with tongues. You could wave around a gleaming silver cue like it was blessed by Saint Dinas himself, and they'd still flinch like you were offering them a rat in a hat. "Come back tomorrow," they'd say, eyes glued to the table, pretending to count onions that weren't there. One poor fellow supposedly buried your copper coins behind his stall and sprinkled salt over the spot, just in case the soil caught shame. It got so ridiculous that some executioners developed workarounds, sending their children if they dared leave the house, leaving payment under rocks, or bartering using vague hand gestures and no eye contact. You could be buying cabbage, and the entire transaction would look like two spies trading secrets in broad daylight. The town acted like your very presence oozed spiritual static. You'd walk into the square and conversations trailed off, like someone had smothered the air in awkward. Midwives crossed themselves. Bakers recited protective chants. Even the cats gave you side eye. Worst of all, Sundays. You'd trudge into the church, hood low, boots squeaking, and the pews would practically lean away. When communion came, The line shuffled past you like you were contagious. And when the priest looked your way, his fingers hovered over the holy water, just a second too long. Not because he forgot the words. The priest hesitated before blessing you, not out of malice, but out of sheer, mortal awkwardness. There you were, standing quietly near the back pew like a shadow in boots, and he looked at you like you were holding the Eucharist hostage. His hand floated above your head mid-sign of the cross, trembling slightly as if divine sanction had a some exceptions apply clause. You could practically hear the mental prayer. Forgive me, Lord, but this one's complicated. Some Sundays, he skipped you altogether and moved on, like you were a smudge on the schedule. Other times, he gave a speed blessing, the verbal equivalent of clicking, I agree, on terms and conditions just to move on with your spiritual download. The townspeople watched with a mix of horror and satisfaction, the way one observes someone poking a beehive with a stick and thinking, well, this should be educational. You knew you weren't welcome. Not really. But it was the only place you could sit in silence without someone asking about sharpening techniques or the cleanup process after a messy disembowelment. Even God's house felt a bit draftier when you walked in, though. And still, you showed up. Not out of piety, necessarily, but maybe in the quiet hope that heaven had a different opinion than the townsfolk. A different ledger. A softer sentence. Because while your blade was sanctioned by king and court, your soul carried the weight of every neck it severed. The sword of justice was heavy, both physically and spiritually. The sword of justice was heavy, both physically and spiritually. No matter how polished the steel or balanced the grip, it never quite sat comfortably in your hands. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol, a burden, a cursed baton passed down from executioner to executioner like a family relic that nobody wanted displayed on the mantle. The crown may have stamped approval on it, and the townsfolk may have cheered assels or winseed, but that sword came with ghosts. It didn't whisper in the night, not literally. This isn't a haunted fairy tale, but you could feel every swing tucked, somewhere deep in the hollows of your chest. The guilt didn't always show up right away. Sometimes it came weeks later, when a dream turned sideways, or a child stared at you a second too long. You'd close your eyes and see the look someone gave you right before you did your duty. Some stared with fear, others with anger, some with relief. All of them stayed. The faces never left. No religious doctrine covered how to spiritually exfoliate after helping justice, along with an axe. Priests were cagey. Philosophers kept quiet. Even wine only blurred it for so long. The sword gleamed in the sun. Yes, but you saw your own reflection in it more than you wanted. You started avoiding polished metal altogether. And still, you maintained it. Because if you didn't, someone else would. Maybe worse. Maybe sloppier, maybe with enthusiasm. You sharpened your blade every night, each scrape a reminder. Not just of the duty you upheld, but of the weight it carried. On shoulders, in conscience, and sometimes in gossip from the baker's wife. The rasp of whetstone against steel echoed through your lonely quarters like a ritual hymn. You didn't need silence to focus. Your thoughts were loud enough. The edge had to be perfect, not out of pride, but necessity. A dull blade meant pain, panic, and pandemonium. And nothing sawed a public hanging like an accidental half job. Each stroke brought back a face, a name, a crowd cheering or wincing, depending on whether their tomatoes had hit the mark. You didn't do it for pleasure. No executioner worth their salt did. But you did take it seriously. Because sloppy work didn't just dishonor the dead, it dishonored the role. Even if that role came with exactly 0 invites to village weddings. Maintenance became meditation. The cold weight of the blade in your lap, the shavings of steel curling like silver fingernails, the rags soaked in oil and silence. It was your only moment of control in a life where everything else was dictated by sentence, schedule, and superstition. The tools didn't judge you. They just obeyed. And after the blade gleamed like a moonlit mirror, you moved to the next step in your nightly penance. You practiced on straw dummies to ensure a clean cut, because nothing turned a solemn execution into a chaotic circus faster than a botched swing. The dummies, shaped vaguely like heads and torsos, often stuffed with rags or hay, stood silently in the corner like judgmental spectators. And in a way, they were. Each cleave had to land with precision, not just power. Too low, you hit collarbone. Too far back, welcome to spinal ping-pong. Too timid, prepare for a grim game of chop and chase. Execution wasn't just a duty, it was a performance. The crowd came expecting drama, but clean drama. No one wanted the grim reality of a half-beheaded convict staggering around like a cursed marionette. Your blade had to be merciful in its efficiency. You weren't supposed to enjoy it, but you were expected to be good at it, and there was no room for rustiness. So you swung, again and again, the cold metal whistling through the air as straw heads tumbled neatly into baskets. You adjusted your stance, your grip, your breathing. You even experimented with dramatic pauses. Not for flair, but because sometimes timing was everything. You practiced like a painter, except your canvas flopped over and leaked. Because when execution day came, there were no second chances, no oops, no artistic interpretation. Just you, the blade, and 1,000 eyeballs waiting for a clean, decisive finish. A bad swing meant screams, flailing, horror, and humiliation in the square. And not just for the poor soul on the block. The crowd didn't see the condemned's suffering as the tragedy. They saw your failure as the real crime. One messy beheading and suddenly you're the town jester, except with more blood and fewer jokes. People would talk, loudly, and for weeks. There was no applause for effort in this line of work. You could be 50 heads in with a perfect record, but botch one neck, and suddenly you were the butcher of Blundersville. Kids made rhymes about it. Old ladies gasped louder than usual. The local alehouse renamed a drink after the incident. Something crimson, sour, and deeply unpleasant. And the worst part, the crowd turned brutal fast. One slip and they weren't cringing, they were booing. Tossing turnips, hurling insults. Someone once threw a shoe. It was a very old shoe. You took it personally. So you doubled down, sharpened harder, practiced longer, and mentally rehearsed clean cuts like a grim ballerina before the big recital. But deep down, tucked beneath all the training and bravado, there was a nagging worry time is merciless. Hands age, muscles stiffen. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year. But someday, you feared the moment when your hand would tremble, not from guilt. That ship had sailed and sunk ages ago. But from age, fatigue, or the creeping realization that you'd outlasted your own usefulness. Execution wasn't a job that allowed for off days. You couldn't say, oops, missed, and blame it on stiff joints or last night's stew. No one shaky swing, and suddenly you were the talk of the tavern. Did you see him today? Took 3 hacks! 3, said between gulps of ile and gleeful shudders. You tried not to dwell on it. Kept your grip strong, your arms trained. But you caught yourself once. Just once. Lingering a second longer before the swing. Wondering if your timing was still perfect. That doubt was more dangerous than any dagger. Because once it crept in, it unpacked, settled down, and started rearranging furniture in your mind. And the stakes weren't just professional pride. You messed up once. Maybe you got heckled. Mess up twice. The town started whispering about a replacement. A younger man. A steadier hand. And if you were really unlucky, they'd suggest training your own son. assuming he hadn't already run for the hills with a lute and a dream of joining the nearest bard troop. So you stayed sharp, focused, calm, and above all, steady, because you knew what this was. It wasn't justice. It wasn't mercy. Executions were public entertainment. Not in the bring your popcorn sense. Though honestly, it wasn't far off. Townsfolk showed up in droves like it was the medieval version of a soap opera, crossed with a horror show. Housewives brought snacks. Children wriggled on shoulders for a better view, and local drunkards provided colourful commentary, whether anyone wanted it or not. The best spots near the scaffold, hot property. Someone once swapped a whole sack of flour just to stand closer to the front row. You'd think witnessing death would be somber, reflective, maybe even dignified. You'd be wrong. People treated it like carnival day, except the clown was crying, and someone might throw up. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts and cider, while blood soaked the dirt just a few feet away. It was spectacle. A bizarre community gathering powered by fear, justice, and morbid curiosity. Kids would reenact executions with dolls. Adults debated whether the convict deserved it, with the enthusiasm of football fans analyzing a bad tackle. And the moment you stepped onto the platform, you stopped being a man and became a stagehand in a morality play. No one asked for. You had to hit your marks, deliver your lines, or the bladed, and not trip over the blood-slicked boards. Because the audience wasn't just watching, they were judging. Every swing was met with gasps or groans. If you were too slow, they booed. Too messy, and the town bard might pen a ballad mocking your aim. Crowds jeered, cheered, spat, and threw filth, and not just metaphorically, actual organic filth. Rotten turnips, stale bread, the occasional mystery rag hurled with the force of moral indignation. Sometimes it felt like the executioner had wandered into a produce-themed uprising. The front row was a splash zone of mud, blood, and very strong opinions. If the axe fell cleanly, they roared with approval like it was a flawless bullseye. If it didn't, well, brace for airborne cabbage. It was a community event, like harvest fairs or angry torch mobs. Bakers paused, kneading dough to catch the action, and tailors took long lunches to see if anyone they stitched a tunic for would end up headless by sundown. Moral superiority hung in the air, thick as smoke from the occasional pyre. That thief got what he deserved, someone would mutter, stuffing their mouth with candied almonds while a head rolled into a basket. Vendors did brisk business. Sausages, candied apples, suspicious pies. One could argue the local economy partially thrived on public punishment. People brought friends, made bets, and sometimes even wrote crude songs if the execution was especially splashy. And in the midst of all this chaos, one tragic tradition reigned supreme. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see the show. Their little feet dangled over their fathers' heads, eyes wide with curiosity and far too much excitement for an event involving a man losing his. Parents whispered commentary like it was a puppet show. That's the judge. Ooh, look, there's the prisoner. Now watch what the man with the hood does. Generational trauma had never been delivered with such a festive air. Some kids cried. Others laughed. A few mimicked the chopping motion later at home using sticks and alarmed chickens. It was a rite of passage in the most unsettling sense. No bedtime story could match the drama of a live beheading at high noon, complete with street music and the distant aroma of mutton pies. This wasn't a punishment, it was programming. They learned early. This is justice, this is order. This is what happens when you steal a bishop's goose. And somewhere in all that noise and spectacle, no one paused to consider the man behind the blade. Because while the crowd's attention was locked on the condemned, head bowed, fate sealed, it was you who drew their deepest revulsion, their fascination, their praise whispered through clenched teeth. You were the final act in this grim theatre, the hammer sealing the sentence. You, the executioner, stood in front of the crowd, the villain and the necessity. Not a man, but a symbol, of law, of consequence, of everything the village simultaneously feared, required, and gossiped about at market. Eyes watched your every move, some filled with awe, others with disgust, a few with envious, because somehow there's always one bloke who thinks chopping heads is glamorous. You didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't blink too much. Silence became your armor, expressionless presence your script. The condemned was the headliner, but you were the closing act. No one wept for you, though you delivered just as much drama. Your boots stuck to the scaffold floor with dried fate. The blade gleamed like moonlight made solid. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, only to peek first themselves. You didn't need to announce yourself. Your reputation carried more than any bell. You adjusted your grip, took your stance. The hush before the blade fell was the most honest silence in town. And then, thwack. Blood would spurt onto your clothes. People would flinch, then cheer. It was an odd rhythm of horror and celebration, a strange choreography of morality, spectacle, and convenient denial. Your garments bore permanent stains, crimson badges of duty, while the crowd clapped, as if you'd just juggled 3 flaming pigs. Some fainted, others clapped louder. A few threw coins, which felt flattering, until you remembered they wouldn't touch your hand at the bakery. You'd stand there, stoic and silent, blood speckled like grotesque confetti. You became an unwilling canvas for each act of justice, dripping with reminders that your job didn't allow for laundry day miracles. Sometimes the victim's family cried. Sometimes they jeered. One man proposed to his sweetheart after an especially smooth disembowelment. Romance was strange in the shadows of the scaffold, and you didn't flinch, couldn't. Flinching implied hesitation. Hesitation implied guilt. No, you just took one small step back to avoid slipping. Because nothing ruins solemn justice like the hangman face, planting into a bucket of arterial spray. You wiped your blade, nodded to the guards, then turned away while the square buzzed with gossip, snack wrappers, and the hollow relief of a public well served. That's how it went day after day through plague, drought, festival, or war. Justice didn't get sick leave, it evolved instead. The sword, axe, and later, the guillotine. Tools of the trade in the ever-evolving art of sanctioned public mayhem. Technology marches on, and so, apparently, did methods of ending people with increased efficiency and less manual splatter. The sword was noble, almost romantic if you squinted and ignored the part where someone's neck snapped like a twig at harvest. The axe, brutal, iconic, occasionally stubborn. It was a working-class hero in execution, circles reliable, hefty, and absolutely terrible at dinner conversation. And then came the guillotine, France's favorite conversation stopper. Clean, crisp, and French engineered to behead with the elegance of a wine pour. It was, frankly, the luxury sedan of death devices. The blade dropped with a satisfying wunk, and voiled. Your crime was solved with Newtonian physics and national applause. It turned executions into mechanical theatre. Some said it was more humane. Others said it was too impersonal. Bring back the artisanal axe, they cried, probably ironically, one hopes. But variety is the spice of death. While heads rolled into wicker baskets with increasing velocity, the justice menu remained delightfully diverse. The rope for hangings, the pyre for heretics, the wheel for traitors. Justice wasn't just about method. It was a full medieval buffet of grim outcomes, each with its own recipe. Hanging was the classic, the vanilla, of executions simple, traditional, slightly unpredictable depending on neck sturdiness and rope quality. Get it right, and it was quick. Get it wrong, and well, the audience might need an intermission snack, while the condemned did an unintended interpretive dance. The pyre, on the other hand, was for those who offended not just the law, but also the heavens, or at least the clergymen who claimed to speak for them. Heretics got fire, and not the cozy, marshmallow kind. This was more. A roaring inferno with a side of moral panic. The crowd showed up less out of bloodlust, and more out of spiritual reassurance. Nothing says, God is love, like roasting someone alive on a festival day. And then there was the wheel. France's answer to the question, what if bones made music? Reserved for those who really upset the social apple cart. The wheel involved strapping someone to a cartwheel and methodically smashing their limbs with a heavy iron bar. It was gruesome, exhausting, and somehow still legal. Executioners weren't just expected to do the deed, they had to work for it. Think less ceremony and more manual labor with extra crunch. Each method had its own prep, rhythm, and pitfalls. It wasn't one size fits all. No, sir. This was a trade, a craft, a dark science passed down through stained hands and exhausted sighs. You weren't just an instrument of law. You were the technician behind the terror, the craftsman of consequence. The unpleasant necessity keeping the wheels, sometimes literally turning. You had to know knots, the angle of a swing, how to build a scaffold, because there were no executioner's guild handbooks lying around. You learned by doing, or preferably, by watching someone older, grimmer, and significantly less squeamish do it first. You had to know which knots slipped quickly, and which ones held tight when a panicked prisoner kicked like a windmill, which timbers wouldn't splinter mid-sentence, and how high the platform needed to be to maximize visibility without accidental nosedives into the crowd. It was logistics with a side of dread. One beam too short, and the rope wouldn't do its job. One angle off, and your axe landed like a drunk squirrel. You weren't just swinging a blade, you were setting the stage, designing drama, calibrating doom. You also learned weird tricks, like soaking the block in water to reduce blood spray, or how to reinforce trapdoors so they didn't give out halfway through a speech. If a noble was being executed, you might get a request for velvet, or God forbid, a monologue. You once spent 5 hours building a custom gallows just because some duke insisted it match the drapery. No matter the prep, you had to be ready for anything last-minute pardons, surprise riots, fainting clergy. It was part tradesman, part showman, part disaster response coordinator. You kept a toolkit the way others kept rosary beads. Close, sacred, and mildly terrifying. After a long day of scaffold carpentry and bodily physics, you didn't walk home like a hero. You didn't relax in the tavern or enjoy the sunset. You trudged away, alone, stained, and silent. You smelled of iron, smoke, and fear. Not because you wanted to. No one wakes up thinking, I'd like to be you to battlefield today. But because it just stuck. The iron came from blood, the smoke from torches and pyres, and the fear, well, that was usually someone else's. But it had a way of lingering on your cloak like bad cologne. You could bathe in rose water, scrub till your skin squeaked, even bribe a perfumer to invent, you'd not a murderer. But the moment you walked past a goose vendor, people still crossed themselves and their poultry. You didn't carry a scent, you carried an aura. The kind that made conversation stop mid-sentence and church bells ring a little sharper. And it wasn't just you. Your tools had reputations of their own. Blades with names whispered like curses. Ropes that had seen more necks than a scarf stand in winter. Tongs that no one ever wanted to ask about. You didn't buy these things off a shelf. They came bundled with your birthright, like a grim starter kit. A slightly bent axe passed down from Uncle Gaspard. A set of branding irons once hidden in a barn for emergencies. And a boot dagger engraved with a questionable family motto. Fiat Justitia, but please don't touch me. These weren't just tools, Your tools were passed down like cursed heirlooms. Not lovingly, of course. No one gathered round the hearth to admire great grandpapa's ankle shackler, but with the quiet inevitability of a haunted piano in a thunderstorm. They came wrapped in burlap, soaked in mystery, and reeking faintly of regret. You'd find them in dusty chests, labelled with your surname in angry letters, each item less family treasure and more sentient liability. The axe still bore a chip from the infamous wig incident. The branding iron had a squeak that sounded suspiciously like guilt, and the garrote came with a handwritten note. Don't forget to oil. Yours forever, Uncle Jax. There was no ceremonial handoff, just a long sigh and a muttered, "You'll need these." And so you kept them, hung neatly in the shed, like murderous wind chimes. You didn't like them, but you didn't dare throw them out either. Who knows what ancestral curse might activate if you tossed the executioner's tongs into the river? Probably a fish uprising. And because you owned such tools, society made sure you fit them. You couldn't live just anywhere. You weren't going to be a charming neighbor in the bustling town center, waving at passing bakers from your window box of geraniums. Oh no. You lived on the edge of town, in a house everyone recognized. Not because it was grand or charming. It most definitely wasn't. But because it radiated a very particular kind of don't come knocking energy. The shutters were always closed. The garden grew exclusively thistles, and the front gate creaked in a way that made passing livestock slightly anxious. If your chimney smoked, people crossed themselves. If your door creaked open, they assumed someone had died or was about to. Halloween wasn't a holiday yet, but your property had strong, year-round haunted hayride vibes. Children dared each other to touch your fence. Adults walked past in pairs and avoided eye contact, as though your gable windows might curse them with neck cramps or intrusive thoughts. The mailman. He tossed letters from 10 feet away, like he was competing in the javelin. Even the rats in town gave your basement a wide berth, which was frankly impressive. And yet, despite the eerie charm of your shadowy estate, you still had to eat, which meant someone had to visit the market. In theory. Because in practice, markets often banned you. You sent your children to shop, but even they were shunned. Not with outright yelling. Oh no, society preferred its shame-marinated and passive-aggressive. The butcher, accidentally, ran out of sausages every time your eldest walked by. The grocer forgot the prices whenever your youngest pointed to a turnip. One particularly dramatic cheese seller fainted upon receiving your coin, which was a bit excessive considering. He once sold to a man who regularly bit pigeons. Sometimes your children came back with empty baskets and watery eyes. Other times, they were tailed home by kids singing charming little ditties like, "Hangman's brat, don't pet the cat," or "It'll hang from a tree just like that." Childhood joy, medieval edition. You tried disguises. Hoods, cloaks, even sending the dog with a note tied to its neck. No luck. Your family name carried more weight than any cloak could hide, and besides, the dog couldn't negotiate the price of cabbage. You contemplated bartering through sock puppets next. It wasn't just cruelty, it was strategic discomfort. Markets were lifelines, and your rope had frayed ends. Some families gave up and lived on stale crusts and bitter root stew. Others found alternatives. Odd jobs. Quiet trades. Barbers sometimes doubled as executioners. A side job to earn bread. One moment they were trimming a noble's whiskers. The next, they were trimming a criminal's sentence. Permanently. Nothing like a little off the top followed by all off the top. Their shop signs should have read, "Shaves, leeches, and judicial decapitations. Walk-ins welcome." It made a weird kind of sense. They already had sharp blades, steady hands, and a certain tolerance for blood and awkward silence. If you could keep a straight face while lancing a boil on someone's cousin, you could probably swing an axe without flinching, or at least without sneezing. A few managed to keep both careers going with eerie professionalism. "Good afternoon, Sir Henry!" "Shall we tackle that mole on your ear today, or the heretic on Main Street?" A still, juggling beauty and beheadings didn't make you more popular. It just meant you had to wash your hands a lot. People whispered when you sharpened your razors a bit too slowly. And heaven help you if you offered a shave right after an execution. A little off the neck, after all, sounded very different coming from you. Because the truth was, no matter how useful you were to society, no matter how precise, practiced, or paid, you weren't just a profession. You were a walking reminder of everything people didn't want to think about. You were the shadow in every festival, the footnote in every sermon, the necessity no one would thank. Loneliness was constant, even if you were paid well. Coins clinked into your pouch. Sure, but they didn't knock at your door for dinner, didn't sit beside you at church, didn't send your children birthday cakes without suspiciously omitting the frosting. Money kept the hearth warm, the larder modestly stocked, and the tools oiled. But it didn't buy friendship. It didn't soothe the sideways glances or lift the silence that dropped when you entered a room. You weren't poor, but you were poorer in the ways that mattered when the sun went down. You ate alone. You drank alone. You fixed the roof tiles alone. Though sometimes a squirrel helped by throwing acorns at your head. Even the town drunk had more company, if only because he occasionally sang ballads about geese. You were the man behind the curtain everyone peeked at, but pretended wasn't there. And in the quiet of night, when the last fire had burned low, and the whetstone rested beside its gleaming charge, it wasn't laughter or companionship that echoed in your thoughts. Each face you saw on the block could haunt your dreams. They didn't all blend together like some might expect. No, they clung to your memory with grim determination. Some wide-eyed and stunned, others hardened with defiance, and a few far too calm, as though they'd already made peace with something you couldn't touch. You tried not to make eye contact. It only made the ghosts more vivid. But every once in a while, just before the hood came down, you'd lock eyes, and it stuck. They followed you home. Not literally, though if one ever knocked, you'd reconsider your career path. But in dreams, in the silence between sharpening strokes, in the way your hand hesitated an inch too long over the whetstone. Some you remembered by name, others by the twitch of a brow or the lilt in a final phrase. All of them asked, in their own way, why? And you, the one tasked with delivering justice, had no proper answer. You saw fear, tears, prayers, and curses. A whole spiritual buffet laid bare in a final 60 seconds. Some wept for mercy, others for mothers. A few threw out language that would have gotten them executed twice if blasphemy were on the docket. One nobleman spat on your boots with such flair, it was almost admirable. Others recited scripture, so fast they sounded like auctioneers of salvation. The air on the scaffold shifted with every step. Some brought trembles, others brought venom. Every execution had its own strange flavor of farewell, the stoic, the shouting, the wait, I can explain, crowd. And through it all you stood silent, professional. The living anvil upon which society hammered out its version of justice. And then there were the ones who spoke softly, who looked up at you, eyes hollow or blazing, and said those words you never stopped hearing. Please, make it quick. Sometimes, the condemned would beg you to make it quick. They'd lean close, breath hitching, voice barely more than a thread of hope stitched into fear. Please, they'd say, like you were a priest, instead of the final punctuation mark in their story. Those moments clung to you more than the blood, because in that instant, They weren't a thief or a heretic or a traitor. They were just someone who didn't want pain to be the last thing they knew. You nodded. Whether you could deliver on that promise depended on a dozen things. Nerves, weather, the last time your elbow cracked ominously. But you tried. You always tried. Because whatever justice meant to the ones in wigs and velvet, to you it meant mercy, when possible, and precision when it wasn't. Then there were the defiant ones. The fire-eyed and bitter-lipped. The ones who looked at you like you were the executioner of their soul, not just their body. They screamed, they cursed, they declared innocence or vengeance or insulted your haircut, which felt unnecessary, given the circumstances. Sometimes they'd spit. Right in your face. Missed the blade, hit the pride. But every once in a while, rare as a kind priest or a soft loaf on market day, someone would look at you, with eyes brimming not with hatred or fear, but calm, acceptance. And they'd say, "I forgive you." Some would spit on you, others would forgive you. And honestly, some did both. Bless them for multitasking their trauma. You never knew what you were walking into. One moment you're bracing for a heartfelt speech, the next you're dodging airborne phlegm. Like it's part of the choreography. There were curses so creative you considered writing them down for future use. Once, a man forgave you and insulted your mother in the same sentence. You didn't know whether to bow or blush, but it wasn't all drama and spittle. Some met your gaze with soft eyes and whispered, "It's not your fault." Which, let's be honest, really messed with your emotional plumbing. You'd nod stoically, then walk off like a mysterious fog. But inside, panic melting, existential jello. What was your fault? Was it the job? The system? The fact that you actually owned a cloak called the bad weather execution cape. And while society forgot their names, you didn't. Not because you were sentimental, but because they left their emotional footprints in your memory like muddy boots on a just mopped floor. And then you'd go home, peel off your splattered clothes, and realize the smell of blood and fear stuck in your clothes, your hair, your home. It clung like a persistent house guest, never invited, never leaving, always sitting in the corner, making awkward eye contact with your dinner stew. You could scrub your tunic until the seams wept. You could air your boots for days. Still, the moment you opened your door, the neighbors sniffed the air and whispered, "Ah." The scent of justice, with notes of regret and dried pancreas. It seeped into your floorboards, your bed linens, your beard. Even your cat developed trust issues. You'd walk into a room and people would mysteriously remember pressing appointments elsewhere, like organizing their spoons alphabetically. Sometimes you thought about starting a lavender garden to mask it. Then you remembered the last time someone gifted you lavender, only to publicly accuse you of trying to hex their goats. You lived wrapped in a fog of consequence, a walking reminder that laws have teeth, and they drool. And then came the revolution. The French Revolution brought the guillotine, cleaner, but not kinder. It arrived on stage like a grim celebrity, flaunting its shiny blade and enlightenment, a proved efficiency. No more fumbling axes, no more repeat swings or awkward apologies to onlookers. Just one sharp drop, and voidal justice served de la mode. They called it humane, progressive, the national razor. Because nothing says liberty like mechanical decapitation with branding. It was sleek, it was swift, and it turned executions into something suspiciously close to assembly line politics. Heads came off so fast, you'd swear the blade had somewhere to be. Revolutionaries lined up lists. You lined up bodies. Gone was the intimacy of the axe. The moment of eye contact, the subtle shoulder twitch before the swing. The guillotine didn't care if you hesitated. It had no nerves, no rhythm, just gravity and steel. And you. You became a lever puller, a ceremonial finger on history's fast forward button. Crowds still came. Of course they did. They brought sandwiches now. Applauded the precision. Took bets on last words. You stood next to a national monument that was somehow still sticky by mid-morning. And when the time came, when the name was read, and the head was bowed beneath the lunate, you pulled the lever, and the head fell into a basket. It was smooth, efficient. Mechanical grace doing what centuries of swinging arms used to. The blade sliced through with a theatrical shunk that echoed off the square's stone walls like a drum roll no one clapped for. 1 second there was a whole person. The next, a very sudden surplus of neck. You didn't flinch. You rarely did anymore. The guillotine didn't care about nerves or noble birth. It was democracy with a blade, cutting all equally, and without small talk. You reset the device, dusted your coat, and gave the platform a casual once, over like a man checking his toolshed, rather than a blood-soaked monument to progress. And then it happened. A twitch. Sometimes the head blinked or moved, and the crowd gasped. Mothers clutched their children. Bakers dropped buns. Even the local poets stopped mid-metaphor. Science would later explain it with words like residual nerve activity and post-decapitation twitch reflex. But back then, it was pure theatrical horror. The eyes would flutter, or the mouth twitched like it had one last thing to say. Probably, well, this is awkward. People told stories of heads grimacing, lips mouthing silent curses, or blinking rhythmically, as if trying to communicate in Morse code with their eyebrows. Superstition gobbled it up like soup. It means their soul rejected judgment.
That one wink it!
He wanted to go. One woman fainted because a head landed facing her, smiling, or grimacing. Who could tell the difference anymore? You just stood there, face carved from stone, with your hand still resting on the lever. Because while the audience gasped and whispered, you had another name to call, another blade to raise, another square to soak. Heads rolled daily during the terror, sometimes dozens per day. Heads rolled daily during the terror, sometimes dozens per day. The guillotine wasn't just busy. It had a queue longer than a bakery during a flour shortage. You practically needed a ticketing system. Now decapitating number 27.
Number 27 to the platform, please!
The blade didn't get lunch breaks. Neither did you. At one point, the scaffold stairs had a high traffic sign. What began as solemn duty quickly morphed into something dangerously close to routine. You sharpened the blade with the same enthusiasm one might have for polishing spoons, then checked your to execute list, which, by the way, now came with subcategories: nobles, loud pamphleteers, suspiciously quiet bakers. Revolutionary justice didn't discriminate, but it did over schedule. By midday, you were 4 heads deep, had blood on both boots, and still hadn't had your morning cider. People joked that your arm was stronger than a blacksmith's, and your posture better than a royal tutor's. Someone suggested you install a slide to make head collection more efficient. You considered it. Briefly. Crowds treated it like a theatre marathon. They brought blankets, snacks, and oddly judgmental parrots. Off with his head! Off with his crackers, please! No one seemed to blink anymore. Heads dropped, people clapped, and someone in the back always muttered, "Not bad, but I preferred Tuesday's finale." And you? You tried to stay professional. You cleaned your blade, nodded curtly, and kept your game face on. But deep down, past the stoic glower and the blood-splattered boots, cracks were forming. Because heads weren't just rolling off a block. They were stacking up in your memory like unpaid debts. Sometimes you saw their faces in your soup. Other times you saw your soup in their faces, which was somehow worse. You went home to silence, to blood-soaked boots at the door, to a cat that looked at you like it knew things. You'd try to sleep, and instead relive head number 16 whispering, "Tell my goat I loved her." You'd try to journal, but all that came out was stick figures with bad haircuts and the word WHY written 16 times. And so, one day, you quietly developed a habit. The weight of these deaths could drive an executioner to drink or madness. And frequently, it did. Strong men crumbled after just a few weeks at the scaffold. Stoics wept into their tankards. A few began talking to their boots. One famously insisted he was being haunted by a vengeful cheese merchant, whose last words had been, "May your dairy curdle forever!" He reportedly burned every wedge of brie he encountered after that. Just to be safe, you tried coping in the accepted ways. Drinking. Naturally. Writing poetry under a pseudonym. That too. Though your rhyming couplets about existential dread and head baskets didn't exactly bring in the literary prizes. You even tried gardening once, until you realized pruning roses felt uncomfortably symbolic. Some executioners pretended it didn't get to them. They made jokes, rolled their eyes, treated heads like potatoes at a harvest fair. Others got weird. One chap insisted on naming every blade he used. Another started drawing little faces on the guillotine's lunette, smiley ones. That lasted until the bishop paid a surprise visit and beheld a cartoonish grin next to a very real decapitation. The bishop fainted. But here's the kicker. Even as you buckled under the guilt and the gore, even as your sleep was haunted, and your beard constantly smelled faintly of regret, despite serving the law, you were seen as unclean. Despite serving the law, you were seen as unclean, not visibly. You weren't covered in grime and cackling in a crooked tower most days, but spiritually, symbolically. People didn't see the civil servant with a strong work ethic and surprisingly precise carpentry skills. They saw death's middle manager. You upheld the law, enforced the will of magistrates, protected the social order. Yet your neighbors treated you like a contagious rash in human form. You could save a kitten from a well, and someone would still mutter, but he was sizing it up for the noose. Invitations to social gatherings, non-existent. The one time someone invited you to a wedding, it turned out they needed you to build the gallows for the flower arch. Cheerful touch, really. Clergy preached justice, nobles demanded it. But no one wanted to shake your hand after you delivered it. You couldn't even drop off a pie without someone calling it the cursed tart of doom. Unfair. It was cherry, despite being essential to society's sense of balance. You were edged out of community life like mold on a particularly judgmental cheese. Children crossed the street. Adults crossed themselves. Cats hissed without provocation, though to be fair, cats do that to everyone. And from that unease, myth took root. Superstitions surrounded executioners. Some believed touching your clothes cured illnesses. Go ahead, Gertrude. Just a graze of his elbow, and your cough will vanish faster than a tax ledger near the bishop. Others believed you brought curses. Simply making eye contact could sour milk, wilt crops, or ensure that someone's goat suddenly forgot how to goat. It was a very confusing social standing. You were both a pariah and a talisman. A walking contradiction in blood-stained boots. You were feared, yet needed. Touched for healing, yet avoided like a sneeze in a monastery. People blamed you for every unlucky sneeze. But when the mayor's cousin got caught forging coin, suddenly your calendar was full. You were the town's most notorious celebrity, like a rock star. If rock stars sharpened blades and had chronic nightmares, kids pointed at your house and whispered stories of glowing eyes and cursed hammers. Merchants raised their prices when they saw you coming, then lowered them again as you passed, just in case charging you extra summoned a misfortune. You once tried to donate to the orphanage. They accepted your coin, then promptly cleansed it in holy water and buried it for 3 days. The orphans didn't mind. They drew guillotines in the dirt and asked if you'd seen real ghosts. You had. Mostly over breakfast. You were law's chosen hand, morality's final chapter, and dinner party kryptonite. Villagers couldn't decide if you were a necessary evil or just evil with excellent aim. But you endured. Because someone had to. Someone had to pick up the axe, reset the blade, uncoil the rope. History didn't pause for feelings. And at the end of each day, when the square was quiet and the torches smoked low, it was still you. Cloaked, tired, human, heading home across cobbled streets, a walking contradiction, and still walking. Marriage prospects were slim. Not non-existent. Mind you, there's a niche for everything. But let's just say, you weren't exactly the town's eligible bachelor. A nice smile and steady income couldn't quite outweigh the whole "I decapitate people professionally" bit. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter when you passed. And matchmakers responded to your inquiries with the kind of silence normally reserved for ghost sightings or tax audits. Even your best "I bake bread on Sundays" stories couldn't quite undo the fact that your formal title sounded like something out of a nightmare bedtime story. And then the hangman came, children, and he trimmed little Timmy's timeline. Romantic candlelit dinners were rare, mostly because open flames made your blood stained, cloaks smell worse. And when you finally found someone who did agree to a date, she brought her priest, and a friend, and a priest for the friend, just in case. Those who did marry into the profession tended to keep it vague on social occasions. My husband. Oh, he's in civil service, very hands-on. Good with knots. And God help your kids. Children were taunted. Your father is the hangman. Not exactly the playground flex one hopes for. While other kids bragged about their fathers being blacksmiths, bakers, or goat whisperers, your child got to shout. Well, at least mine has excellent axe handling skills, which unsurprisingly didn't land well at birthday parties. They weren't invited to many, anyway. One mother once said, "We'd love to have little Margot over, but we're concerned her presence might summon things." Summon what? The ghost of overcooked stew. No one ever clarified. School was no better. Teachers called the roll with subtle pauses. "Jane, Claude Mary, Executioner Junior. Are you here? Dear." The poor child's art projects were scrutinized like possible evidence. "That's a very lovely house. Sweetheart. What's that red part dripping off the roof?" And when it came time for career day, let's just say one enthusiastic presentation involving a model guillotine, a watermelon, and a few too many sound effects resulted in a temporary ban from all educational activities involving crafts or fruit. But even with all the social exile and fruit-related drama, the family stuck together. Because, as grim and misunderstood as the job was, it was a job. Executioners were paid per execution and by the state. A nice, tidy arrangement, slice ahead, earn your bread. Efficient. Brutal. Bureaucratic. Your job came with a ledger, not applause, though occasionally you received both, which made accounting very awkward. Rates varied depending on the method. A hanging might earn a few coins, and a very awkward handshake, while noble beheadings sometimes came with bonuses, like a roast goose or the Duke's favorite wine, hopefully before it spilled on your trousers mid-swing. Of course, delays weren't unheard of. Governments, being governments, sometimes forgot to pay. Apologies, sir. Your severance package is still being processed. Meanwhile, if you could kindly separate this gentleman's head from his political leanings. You became familiar with debt, bartering, and the bitter taste of stew made entirely of turnip. Some wrote petitions. Some sharpened their blades in a menacing manner near tax offices. You never technically threatened a clerk, but you did leave your cleaver on the counter, while asking about missing wages. and when coins were scarce. Well, sometimes they kept the clothes of the condemned as payment, which sounds ghoulish, because it was. But when your employer forgets payday, and your pantry echoes louder than the town bell, you get resourceful. That fancy doublet the Baron wore to his beheading, yours now. Those silk stockings that once graced a seditious poet, rolled up and repurposed as winter mittens. If it had buttons, you buttoned it. If it had embroidery, you convinced yourself it looked vintage, not haunted. It became a weird side hustle, fashioned by misfortune. You'd stroll into town in a brocade waistcoat, last seen on a traitor mid-sentence, and people would whisper, "Nice, that Lord Bastion's." You'd nod solemnly and mutter, "He said it never fit quite right." Sometimes, if the victim had particularly nice boots, you'd stretch them over the fire to reshape them. Of course, they'd squeak when you walked, which was deeply unsettling in a town already convinced your footwear was cursed. One overly chatty widow once asked if you sold second-hand hats. You paused, considered it, and decided one more curse wouldn't hurt the brand. But scavenged, wardrobe or not, you remained an outcast with excellent taste. They were given certain legal protections but few friends. Officially, the law said, "Touch not the executioner, for he is the state's chosen blade," which sounded noble, until you realized it mostly meant no one's allowed to punch him. But they also won't invite him to the maypole dance. You couldn't be arrested easily, but you also couldn't borrow sugar without a full neighborhood referendum. It was like diplomatic immunity, except you were immune to hugs, birthdays, and polite dinner conversation. Technically, you had the right to walk freely, buy land, and defend your honor. In practice, you walked awkwardly. No one wanted to sell you land, unless it was shaped like a skull. And defending your honor mostly involved stern glares and standing alone at village festivals, holding a turkey leg with eerie solemnity. Even your mailbox got weird. People either shoved bribes in it, "Please lose my cousin's paperwork," or left passive, aggressive trinkets like garlic, salt circles, or oddly specific pamphlets titled, "How Not to Be Emotionally Haunted by Your Own Profession, a Clerical Perspective." Thanks, Susan. And just when you thought your RA Summe couldn't get any more cursed, some were forced to moonlight as torturers, adding screams to their duties. Because apparently lopping off heads wasn't enough fun for one lifetime. Nothing says career flexibility like being handed a red-hot poker and a polite note that reads, "Also, we need you to make Jean-Pierre talk, preferably today. Bring your own pliers." You weren't just an executioner anymore. You were a part-time interrogator, part-time medieval chiropractor, and full-time regretting your life choices. It wasn't glamorous work. No one tossed coins your way with a cheerful, "Bravo, Monsieur.
Excellent toe stretching."
You were led into cold stone rooms with dim torches and an ambience best described as moist dread. The tools. Oh, a real party mix: racks, thumbscrews, branding irons, tongues shaped like things no blacksmith should be proud of. And you had to know them. Not in a collector of fine instruments way, but in a "this lever makes the spine sound like a harpsichord" kind of way. Worst of all, people thought you enjoyed it. As if you sipped mulled wine while tuning the rack to D minor. Truth was, you didn't sleep for days after a session. You developed a guilty twitch every time someone cracked their knuckles. And heaven help you if anyone asked, "Have you got a good grip strength?" at a dinner party. But this was the justice system's prelude. The grim overture before the grand finale. Before execution, torture was used to extract confessions. 'Cause nothing says truthful testimony like being stretched until you develop a sudden interest in confessing to everything from treason to stealing your cousin's soup spoon. Judicial systems back then had a flair for the dramatic. Why settle for innocent until proven guilty, when you could have innocent until screaming? You weren't just trying to make people talk. You were trying to make them admit something. Anything. Preferably in Latin, if possible. And while magistrates sipped watered wine and discussed legal ethics, you were downstairs performing what can only be described as extremely medieval customer service. Let's not forget the record keeping. Oh yes, someone had to write it all down, quill in one hand and existential dread in the other. Subject began shouting at the mention of soup, maybe connected to stolen livestock or allergies, and when polite questioning failed, that's when you broke out the classics: breaking on the wheel, using thumb screws, or burning feet with sulfur. Torture wasn't subtle. It wasn't even imaginative half the time. It was more like a greatest hits album of, please make it stop. The wheel? That was the headliner. A literal cartwheel. Repurposed by history's least whimsical party planners, where limbs were threaded through the spokes and then, well, let's just say bone structure became more of a suggestion than a fact. Victims were left looking like a poorly assembled puppet, and a cautionary tale rolled into one. Thumbscrews. The name was misleadingly quaint, like something a medieval Etsy shop might sell beside artisanal flagellation ropes. In reality, it turned thumbs into regret-flavored pancakes, a surprisingly popular choice with tax evaders and mild heretics. And then there was sulfur foot roasting. Yes, someone looked at a pair of innocent feet and said, you know what this needs. Alchemy and screaming. They'd coat the soles in something flammable and set it gently ablaze, like fondue. If the cheese was pain, and the breadsticks were just raw human panic. And through all of this theatrical agony, there was you. Not in a shadowy corner twirling a mustache. You tried once, it didn't suit your cheekbones, but nearby, waiting. Timing. Listening. Because these weren't executions yet, they were preludes. Dirty, screeching preludes. Designed not to kill, but to extract. Confessions, names, details, epiphanies, real or invented by delirium. And as your day job loomed, you had to stand by, tallying the confessions, nodding at the scribes, resetting the guillotine blade for its next guest, all while the stone walls echoed. You had to listen to screams and begging, knowing death was coming regardless. It was like watching someone desperately glue feathers onto their arms mid-fall. Tragic, pointless, and distressingly loud. No matter what they confessed, whether truth, lies, or their favorite childhood jam recipe, the gallows still waited, still yawned wide. The executioner didn't deliver salvation. He delivered scheduling. Sometimes they begged you directly, as if you had veto power. Please, I'll tell you everything. Just not the wheel again. And you'd have to nod politely while mentally reviewing tomorrow's scaffold lineup and wondering if lunch would involve less screaming. Spoiler, it wouldn't. There were different types of cries too. Some were pleading sobs. Others were operatic shrieks that made you wonder if the condemned had missed their calling at the Paris Opera. One fellow sang sea shanties mid-rack crank. Another tried to sue you through a screaming legal argument about unlicensed torture technique. Impressive, considering his teeth were on the floor. You tried not to listen. You really did. But it wormed into your ears, into your sleep. Even the town roosters seemed to crow at just the wrong pitch. The Smithsonville sounded like distant howling if your nerves were frayed enough. And they usually were. Because in many cases, the worst wasn't the noise. It was the sheer futility. The ritual. The grinding absurdity of wringing secrets from someone marked for oblivion. Torture often continued even when the condemned were near death. Logic had long since left the room, probably shrieking out the window around the third broken rib. and what remained was bureaucracy with a whip. The scribe still scribbled, the magistrate still nodded, and you, regrettably, still stood nearby pretending that this was all part of some grand, necessary process rather than a deeply unpleasant performance of medieval overkill. The accused would barely be conscious, held upright by sheer adrenaline, and whatever hope hadn't yet seeped into the floorboards. Confess, they'd croak, sometimes in response to no one in particular. You'd watch magistrates lean in, ears perked like squirrels, waiting for acorns of guilt. And when the confession finally came, it was often something like, "I stole pears in the summer of '84," or, "Tell my cow she was right about the moon." Or at that point, the body was failing, the eyes unfocused, but still the torment continued. It was as if the justice system had mistaken volume for virtue. The rack creaked, the iron sizzled, and you stood there wondering if anyone truly felt better after hearing that a man once forgot to tithe or used coarse language during soup. And when the scribes finally looked satisfied, when the judges gave their solemn nods and scribbled the date for execution in cursive doom, that's when the human reappeared. Sometimes the condemned confessed final words, asked you to send messages, or wept. It was like a very grim postal service. "Really? Please tell my wife I loved her. Remind my brother where I hid the silver." Or, "Whatever happens, do not let Pierre get my boots. He knows what he did." You became an accidental message courier, funeral planner, and spiritual therapist all in one. Some wept so profusely, you felt the urge to hand them a tissue. Except tissues hadn't been invented, and you weren't emotionally equipped for that level of vulnerability. Especially not before breakfast. Others clutched your cloak with the desperation of someone who just realized their afterlife insurance was non-refundable. The messages ranged from profound to perplexing. One man, mid-sob, begged you to avenge his chicken. You nodded solemnly. It felt right. And then, of course, there were the spicy ones. Others cursed the king, the church, and you personally. You learned to nod through a variety of insults, some of which were so creative they bordered on poetry.
"May your bread always be soggy!"
One screamed. "May your socks never match,
"And your cat judge you forever!"
Another shouted from the scaffold, moments before kicking over your bucket out of sheer spite. Sometimes it was theatrical rage, fists raised to the sky, invoking doom upon every institution and half the Baker's Guild. Other times it was more personal, your mother, your handwriting, your uneven sideburns. Nothing was off limits. You tried not to take it to heart. After all, being the messenger of state, sanctioned death didn't exactly win you popularity contests. Still, there was a certain sting when someone shouted, "I curse you with eternal dandruff," as their parting jab. You weren't even sure if that was medically possible, but it itched your soul a little. There was a pattern to it all. The anger, the rage, the dramatic declarations of injustice or indignation. None of it surprising. You were the last face they saw before leaving the world, and apparently the most curseable. You wished they'd at least acknowledge your excellent punctuality. And yet, in the middle of all the fury and damning monologues, you might hold the hand of a trembling boy or a crying woman. Their fingers, ice, cold and shaking, would grip yours like you were the last solid thing in a world gone liquefied. Sometimes they whispered things, fragments of lullabies, apologies to long-dead siblings, confessions involving suspiciously vague barn incidents. A few just murmured, "Mama," over and over, as if she might descend from the sky, slap the blade away, and wrap them up in forgiveness and soup. In those moments, you weren't the executioner. You were a human, shaped lighthouse in a storm of iron and fire. A strange anchor in their final fog. You didn't speak much. It felt wrong to lie or soothe. But you held on, even if your gloves were blood-stained and your heartbeat sounded like, "I want to quit." On loop, you held on. And afterward, when the body was still, when the sobs turned to silence and the square reset itself for the next act, you'd step back. Exhale. Reset, and bury it deeper. Because if you felt it, if you truly felt every trembling palm and every desperate look, you'd collapse like a house of hay in a rainstorm. There were too many faces, too many goodbyes. Too much grief carved into too little space behind your ribs. You learned to shut your feelings off, or it would destroy you. You learned to shut your feelings off, or it would destroy you. You couldn't carry every name, every tear, every last whispered, "Please." There wasn't enough room in your chest for all that grief. So you built walls, thick ones lined with dark humor and routine. You became punctual, precise, eerily calm. You sharpened your blade like it was a form of prayer, your only meditative act between acts of state-sponsored drama. When people said, "He's cold," they weren't wrong, but they weren't quite right either. You weren't cold, you were preserved, like meat in salt. Feel too much, and you'd crack like a bad joint under stress. So you didn't feel, you just functioned. An artisanal dispenser of justice, mechanical in motion, and increasingly allergic to internal monologues. But despite your best efforts to be emotionless and efficient, there was one moment, one cruel possibility, that could crack through even your practiced shell. A miss. If your sword swing missed, you had to swing again, with the crowd screaming. And not the good kind of screaming, like, "Brilliant technique!" or "Encore?" No, this was the panicked, horrified, "Did he just decapitate that turnip stand instead?" kind of screaming. Missing was the executioner's equivalent of tripping on stage at the Royal Ballet, except instead of bruised pride, you got existential horror and a room full of traumatized peasants. You'd steel your nerves, take aim like a solemn, sweaty lumberjack of justice, and thwack. Nothing but a dented collarbone and an awkward silence, broken only by someone in the front row dropping their lunch. And then came the second swing. Oh, the second swing. No one likes sequels, especially not when the original ended in mid-decapitation. The condemned is screaming, the crowd is screaming, and you're internally screaming louder than both. At that point, your hands are slippery, your dignity is tap dancing off the scaffold, and you're just hoping your next move doesn't land you in someone's haunting diary. And if you think that was try hanging, a rope breaking during a hanging meant a second attempt, sometimes on a dying person. A rope breaking during a hanging meant a second attempt, sometimes on a dying person. There is no applause for an encore in this line of work, only awkward silence and someone in the front row dropping their sausage. You'd hoist the condemned, say your solemn words, "Pull the lever, snap," and suddenly it's less grim justice and more spontaneous stage dive, or worse, if they landed upright. Everyone just stood there blinking like, "Now what?" And you, ever the professional, had to dust off your dignity, fish out a backup rope, and try again while the crowd speculated whether the condemned had divine immunity or just an incredibly thick neck. Some tried to play it cool. You see, even God disagrees, which earned them a few extra minutes of attention, right up until gravity got a second go. Others were less dramatic and simply groaned from the cobblestones while you explained to your apprentice, rope quality, not optional, and pity the poor fellow who landed wrong, winded, wheezing, half-conscious, already regretting his final words. "You'll never take me alive!" Well, guess what? The rules were simply if the hanging failed, you didn't pack up and go home. You retied the noose and hoped version 2 didn't include mid-air spinning. Because if people didn't make it to the scaffold, torture that killed the condemned early meant you faced inquiries or punishment. Yes, Because nothing adds spice to a morally ambiguous career like getting scolded for accidentally being too efficient at suffering. It was a bureaucratic nightmare: paperwork, inquests, and grumpy magistrates sighing over tea. Yes, we wanted him to talk, but not exit the conversation permanently. The rules were clear. Ish torture was to extract confessions, not to punch someone's soul ticket early. If your prisoner expired mid-scream, you'd have to explain whether it was the sulfur, the screw, or your personal flair for dramatic timing. Torture, not murder. They'd remind you, as though separating the two was easy, when elbows were snapping like breadsticks. Some executioners developed a reputation for over-enthusiasm, earning nicknames like Too Much Jackers or Madame Twist a Lot. You, however, prided yourself on restraint, mostly. But even you weren't immune to the occasional "oops, he died" moment, especially when the condemned was more fragile than anticipated. So looking at you, Duke René the Wheezy. Sometimes it ended with a warning, sometimes with a fine, and in particularly awkward cases, the torturer had to apologize to the family. "Sorry for evaporating your uncle. Here's a complimentary cloak." One fellow was forced to reenact the entire Inquisition on potatoes just to demonstrate what he meant to do. The crowd gave it 3 stars. The potatoes fared worse, but even if you survived the inquiries and the eye rolls of the clergy, the long-term consequences weren't as easy to wash away. And they didn't just follow you. They followed your bloodline, the executioner's family. Your children often inherited your role. It wasn't exactly the dream, but in a family where the tools of the trade were kept in a special cabinet right next to the soup ladle, career conversations were limited. Young Philip didn't get asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Because everyone already knew. You're going to swing the axe like your father, and your grandfather, and your great-uncle Jean, Claude, who only stopped after the incident with the bishop and the goose. It was generational, like a bakery, but with more screaming and fewer croissants. Sons trained early, learning blade angles, not tying, and how to keep a straight face while someone called you murder's butler. Some kids learned to ride bikes. Your kid learned where to stand so the blood spray formed less of a Jackson Pollock. And heaven help the child who wanted out. But Papa? "I want to be a mime!" You'll mime the art of restraint on the rack. Now fetch me the leg tongues. Creative dreams had a way of being redirected. As for daughters found it hard to marry. Not because they lacked charm, wit, or a delightful talent for baking questionable pies. It's just that their surname might as well have been Von Butcher. Prospective suitors showed up with flowers and left with existential dread. One poor boy, upon realizing he was dining with the executioner's family, excused himself to check the goats and was last seen sprinting toward the river, never to court again. At dances, girls from butcher or baker families twirled merrily across the floor, while executioners' daughters sat near the punch bowl, sipping awkwardly and pretending not to overhear whispered phrases like, "I heard she sharpens the blades with her tears." One girl tried passing off her father as a state-employed lumberjack, but that fell apart when someone saw him oiling the family axe and humming ominously. Even when a suitor did show promise, brave, tolerant, only mildly superstitious, it rarely lasted. Eventually, someone's grandmother would lean in and hiss, "If you marry into that line, your crops will rot and your children will speak backwards." Which, admittedly, was a little dramatic, but superstition rarely stops for logic or love. And those daughters who did marry, saints, warriors, women of remarkable patience and emotional elasticity. Wives dealt with constant fear, shame, and social isolation. It wasn't quite the romantic future promised in fairy tales. Unless your idea of a fairy tale includes daily laundry soaked in existential dread and small talk that begins with, "So, how many today?" Their husbands came home smelling like iron and regret. Conversations over dinner were a gamble. One wrong question, and you'd hear about how a count's nephew whimpered like a goat during sentencing. "Please, dear," the wife would say, sipping her broth slowly. Just past the salt without the graphic imagery. And markets were worse. Other women would whisper behind shawls. Vendors gave discounts. With trembling hands. And if your husband had recently executed someone's cousin, you might find a fish in your laundry or a chicken in your doorway with a very accusatory expression. They didn't get many visitors. Neighbors forgot to invite them to festivals. Parish priests kept blessings brief and vague. May your household persist. Still, they endured, held the family together, sewed cloaks, calmed frightened children, pretended not to notice when the boots came home red, and when the knock came at night. When another name was added to the list, they exhaled, tightened the shutters, and waited for dawn. Because theirs wasn't just a household, it was a lineage. Generations of families lived under the weight of blood. The family crest practically needed a mop on it. At this point, you weren't just born into a lineage. You were handed a whetstone and a set of emotional complications in the crib. Little family gatherings came with awkward silences whenever someone asked, "So what line of work are you in?" And 5 people answered, "The axe line." There were family heirlooms that weren't rings or spoons, but annotated torture manuals and boots that squelched ominously. Children played with miniature gallows for educational purposes and passed around bedtime tales like the little guillotine that could. Great Aunt Bernadette insisted the family tree should be drawn in red ink for historical accuracy, and no one could argue with her, mostly because she kept the finger screws as paperweights. You didn't just carry your ancestors' name, you carried their reputation and occasionally their cursed elbow tongs. Even the pets looked wary. The family cat, perpetually judgmental and possibly haunted. The parrot knew too much. Over the years, the line blurred between duty and doom, until some hares started sharpening knives absent-mindedly during meals and others stared into soup like it might whisper state secrets. It wasn't tradition. It was inevitability wrapped in melancholic lace and iron. And when the weight became too much, when the parade of heads, screams, and bad dinner conversations finally cracked the marrow, some executioners drank themselves to death. And honestly, after decades of unsolicited bloodbaths, public scorn, and being known as that guy who ruined every festival, who could blame them? Mead became meditation. Wine became forgetfulness. Absinthe, that was practically a therapist in liquid form. If the therapist wore a skull mask and whispered, "Try not to dream tonight," you'd find them slumped over tavern counters, mumbling to steins as if hops held the answers. Some pubs even had executioner specials, a pint, a pie, and a sympathetic nod. One famous hangman, known only as Bernard the Melancholy, once tried to challenge a bar stool to a duel. It won. For some, drink was a slippery slope. For others, it was the only slope, and they were sledding headfirst down it in their underpants. It dulled the noise, numbed the shame, and blurred the edge of the axe. Metaphorically, though occasionally also literally, which made for very awkward mornings. And when the drink didn't finish them outright, time usually did. Quietly, unceremoniously. Some died anonymously, their graves unmarked. No noble send-off, no speeches. Not even a modest tombstone reading. Here lies someone who was very punctual and mildly terrifying. Just a patch of overgrown earth behind the churchyard, occasionally mistaken for a turnip patch. Priests muttered something vague and bless why. The gravedigger, depending on mood, offered either a moment of silence or an off-key whistle. One executioner was buried in the same ditch as his confiscated hats, though that was possibly more protest than coincidence. The irony? These were people who had their hands in the final chapters of everyone else's story, and yet their own ended like a misprinted footnote, forgotten, leafless, and very underground. Sometimes, even the coffins were reused. One executioner was reportedly buried in an old butter barrel. We assume he didn't mind. He liked butter. But not all slipped quietly away. Others retired, but were never truly free of the whispers and stares. You could hang up your cloak, store the axe behind the pantry flower, and start referring to yourself as a consultant in terminal negotiations. But the village still knew. They always knew. Even if you took up gardening, your tomatoes would be labelled sinful, yet well pruned. You'd try to attend church, only to find an entire pew mysteriously empty around you. You'd go to market, and the fishmonger would hand you haddock using salad tongs, just in case your touch activated some ancient hex. One man retired and opened a bakery. His bread was excellent. Light crust. Good crumb. But the villagers kept whispering things like, "He probably needs it with ghost hands." Children would poke sticks at your fence. Teenagers dared each other to touch your doorknob. A milkmaid once left an offering of lavender and a live chicken on a retired hangman's doorstep, just to ward off generational curses. He used the lavender for tea. The chicken now answers to Maurice. And yet, through all the awkward bows and polite, but panicked laughter, people still tipped their hats. Because deep down, they knew something their ancestors knew too. Executioners were necessary for justice to function in medieval and revolutionary France. Unpopular maybe, uncelebrated definitely, but essential. Like plumbing or unpleasant uncles with legal expertise. You didn't toast to them at feasts. No ballads sang their glory. No tavern tales began with, "Gather round, children. Let me tell you about Bertrand the efficient decapitator." And yet, without them, the gears of justice ground to a squeaky rope, entangled halt. They were the final stamp on royal orders, the punctuation at the end of revolutions. Laws could be written, judgments declared. But at the end of the line, when the crowd had gathered, the drums were rolling, and someone had to turn civic disapproval into cleanly severed symbolism. Guess who stepped up? Not the philosophers, not the bishops, the guy with the axe. And so he remained in society's strange paradox, absolutely necessary, but preferably not seen, heard, or seated next to anyone at supper. Because they lived hated, lonely, and surrounded by death. Honestly, it was like being the Grim Reapers exhausted in turn. No recognition, no vacation, and everyone assumed you smelled faintly of despair, and occasionally, onions. Neighbors avoided you like you were selling expired fish. Children used your house as the ultimate dare. "I bet you won't knock on the door." What if he answers? Then we move villages. Even the town cat, who once licked its own eyeball, wouldn't make eye contact with you. Social invitations, sparse. Wedding seating charts placed you somewhere between extra chair and maybe outside with the turnips. One poor soul tried joining a choir after retiring, but no one wanted to harmonize with someone whose stage experience involved scaffolds and last words. And yet you carried on. Because while everyone else got to avert their eyes, you had to look. Over and over. Through the bravado, through the terror, through the showy last-minute monologues about injustice or unwashed laundry. You didn't just see death. They saw the worst of humanity. And sometimes, the last moments of innocence. 1 minute you're watching a thief curse the heavens while trying to bite through the ropes. And the next you're hearing a soft, spoken boy ask if his dog will be okay without him. You stood there, surrounded by iron and protocol. as someone whispered a prayer to a god they hadn't spoken to in years, just in case the afterlife accepted last-minute applications. Sometimes they tried to sing, sometimes they cried. One swore blind that he'd been framed by a goat, and honestly, you almost believed him. You saw bravery, panic, hallucinations, and once, a man who tried to fake a faint so hard, he actually did pass out mid-sentence. But through it all, you weren't allowed to flinch. Not when the drunk confessed to loving his horse more than his wife. Not when the teenage girl tried to hold your hand through the blindfold and whispered, "Tell my sister I was good." You just stood there, wrapped in state authority, while the wheels of fate clanked forward like an emotionally damaged clock. And yet, someone always took the job, because the state demanded it. No application form. Just a nod, a tool belt full of moral ambiguity, and a cloak that never quite stopped smelling like historical trauma. You didn't grow up dreaming of it. But one day, someone handed you the ledger, the key to the dungeon, and said, "Make it official." So you swung the axe, tied the knots, watched the faces, heard the screams, bore the guilt, dodged the curses, collected the pay, buried your name, and tried, when the crows circled low and the wind smelled like ash, to convince yourself that someone had to, that you were just a cog, a necessary shadow. And when your hands trembled and the blade dulled and the townspeople still wouldn't look you in the eye, you told yourself this, you kept the system moving, you ensured justice happened. You did the job no one else dared to do, and the world moved on, as it always did, leaving you behind in the margins, blood-stained but necessary, the ghost no one invited, yet everyone depended on. Disclaimer: while we've done our absolute best to stay rooted in historical fact, yes, even the sulfur-foot roasting bits, some details may have taken creative liberties or gotten mildly singed by the torch of comedic exaggeration. History is full of gaps, and sometimes we fill those gaps with snark because, well, medieval trauma pairs best with a little levity. So if a date is off, or a thumb screw was technically 2 centimeters wider, please chalk it up to enthusiasm, not deception. We aim to honor the truth and chuckle nervously beside it. Now then, dear night owl, you've wandered through centuries of executions, curses, boot stealing, and emotionally complex poultry. That's quite enough for one evening, so go to sleep. Yes, you, right now, tuck in, close your eyes, and dream not of racks and nooses, but of a peaceful village where no one sharpens anything before breakfast. Sleep like a guiltless noble with a perfect alibi. Tomorrow, history will still be weird,